was president 76 to 78. And, of course, I spent 2 years as second vice prior to that. And in those days, the second vice did the all-state band and choir that put together the all-state groups. So that was the responsibility there. Bob Miller was president at that time. It's amazing once you retire or leave it, and I'm still semi-active doing things at clinics and guest conducting, that sort of thing. But you really lose track, except there's one thing I hear, and it brings up the old adage that I learned years ago, that in education everything's just a big circle, keeps going around and around. Same old stuff year after year, new faces, new names. We were talking about that earlier because out in the hallway, because one of the things I remember during my presidency was that we were in a period of time of riffing, reduction in force, and districts were laying teachers off, programs were being cut, music programs, of course, right there in the forefront, we got to cut this. So we developed what was called a crisis kit. And we put together a bunch of material and a tape and packaged it into a mailable package and mailed those out to people that were having problems retaining their job or in fear of possibly losing the job or just plain trying to promote their program in the district, which now they use the word advocacy. Same problems. I know. As an outsider, I consider myself an outsider now looking in, but I hear of things and it just brings back memories of things that happened back then. But different words applied to it. But the problems don't quit. You still got to fight like crazy to keep a music program because people think excellence in education is the big byword now. Yes, it is. But as I told an audience the other night, they had just been witnessing excellence in education at that concert. And if you start cutting music out, you're going to be cutting excellence out of education. There are enough brain studies to substantiate what that can do for a student in music. So I'm sympathetic to the problems they're having, but they don't strike me as being new or unusual. They just are new to those people experiencing them now. Another thing that I remember from the time I was in office as president, I actually served 10 years because then 2 years past president, and then Jack Potter passed away when he was starting his past presidency, and so they called me back to fill the rest of his term out, and Carla was president at that time. But we also developed the Retired Teachers Program, in which WMEA encouraged people to hire retired people to come in and do clinics, rehearse the bands and their choirs, or work with them and mentor them. Now it's called mentoring. And it's a different name. It's structured a little differently. But the concept is the same. And people do not utilize other people's brains enough, in my opinion, including conductors. I caught myself being so guilty of allowing my kids to use my brains under the guise of trying to make that rehearsal go, keep it moving, make sure we get this done, that done, and the other thing done, but overlooking an important aspect, in my opinion, of education, and that is let's get the little guys out in front of you using their brains, just like the use of the strobe. Oh, the strobe came in, and that was the big thing. Everybody was buying a strobe, and you'd set it up in front of the band and the choir, and they could come up there and they could tune their instruments and all that. I was suddenly beginning to realize that, geez, my kids are tuning up there looking at that strobe, but the band wasn't playing well in tune. And then it dawned on me. The strobe was a useful tool, except the kids were using their eyes to make that wheel stand still. They weren't listening to what was happening as much as watching. So we took it away. It made a big difference. They suddenly had to start using their own brains, their own ears. Am I right that there's trying to do some revisions on the Constitution? I don't know. That was a big thing when I became president. Prior to my being president, the hue and cry was terrible then, and it probably exists now, and I bet it does, is that we've got to get the regional people more involved out in the state. There just is not enough involvement from the regional areas, those officers and people. So we had what was the very first WMEA board retreat, and it was in Yakima, and we spent 3 days at the what then would become the headquarters hotel in a retreat where I gathered the whole board together, got them away from all their other things that were bothering them and having to do in life. This was in the summer, and that was the big focus that summer. We revised the Constitution, and then later it was presented and passed through the state to get districts more involved, districts, regions, whatever you want to call them. And now I'm hearing things like, gee, we got to get the districts or regions more involved. Strange. I heard that song before, too. So I'm not minimizing what's going on now. I'm merely saying that I'm sympathizing with what's going on because I think many of us in the past experienced the same things with different names attached to them, different people involved. Maybe one aspect or another was more critical than another than today, but still the same kinds of problems. You just got to fight for it, on and on and on. And I'll bet you've heard that more than once today. Well, I think as an organization, it was it was there to support teachers, promote the programs in the district, the things we've been talking about. The importance of music. It's not an activity. It's a class with a credit, the same as English or math. Band, they say, oh, that activity. Well, just because the band happens to be a medium that can supply a pep band or a marching band and help out the athletic department or whatever other function the superintendent may ask you to do for the community, that does not make it an activity. It just happens to be because of the peculiarity of that medium. I say a band particularly because they're called to do so many other things, and they lie outside the school day. But it's called music education, right? Band, choir, orchestra, theory, guitar, piano, music education. It gets a credit along with English, math, right? You betcha. It gets the same amount of credit, 1 credit per. How come it doesn't get the same kind of treatment and importance? That's a question that we're constantly fighting and having to explain over and over and over. And I would encourage the current music teachers to not get discouraged, but to anticipate that and get armed so they can explain it. Because many times what they perceive as criticism is merely somebody asking for information. And the music teachers are not always the best people to articulate verbally what we need and why it's important and that sort of thing. They tend to draw into their own shell or their own group. Oh, I understand music, he understands it, but they don't understand it, so we'll stay here. That's not a good approach. You got to get out. You got to get out and get the message out to people. That's exactly what WMEA should be doing. One of the things is that we worked hard to try and get more involved and closer to the state music supervisor, is what it was called in those days, and it was music supervisor, to get them involved in what we were doing and get them to support us more. And so gradually that became more apparent. We began to get more monetary support for various things that WMEA was trying to do. So the big push then, as it is now, I'm sure, is to increase the membership. Why? Because there are things we can offer that are important for you. The convention certainly is important. And conventions could be fun, too. In fact, I've got one funny anecdote. I have to tell this. At Bob Miller's convention, he was president when I was second vice, and at the head table that night at the conference banquet, Bob thought, okay, he's going to fix me up good. So he was doing various introductions and so forth, and he introduced me as second vice president. He says, oh, by the way, Bernie, Fifi LaRue said you left your glasses at her place. And I said, oh, gosh, thanks, Bob, and you're right, her prices are ridiculous. We had fun in those. I'm not sure I've seen people have fun anymore at conventions. At my own convention, I had advertised that our convention speaker was this important music educator from England, from Britain, and we had him pictured, in the picture that he used was like the old Sherlock Holmes type hat and the pipe, the whole bit. Well, actually, he was an impersonator from Yakima. Now, nobody knew that I'd hired him for the convention, except Jack Potter, and he and I were the day before the convention started, we're working with some of the local people, and they said, you know, I can't even think of his name, such and such, he looks exactly like this guy from Yakima. And Jack looked at me, and I looked at him and said, you're kidding, really? Well, we pulled that sucker off, and this guy got up there, and he starts talking, you know, in Great Britain now, we do this sort of thing, and he's going on, and pretty soon, the whole story starts to unravel and unravel, and he got into topography and geography somehow, and the beautiful mountains we have here, and the one thing he had learned was, well, of course, you got to be careful not to eat the yellow snow. By then, the whole thing became apparent to the audience. They had been hoaxed. We hooked them, and it was funny. It was a light moment, and there aren't enough of those. There aren't enough of those, in my opinion. The conventions that I've got to since then, serious, too serious, I'm sorry. There's time for frivolity also. And what was memorable about that is the lady who taught elementary music education here at Central Washington had planned a trip that summer to England to study, and she came up afterwards and really read me off. She was just absolutely furious because she had so anticipated listening to this man talk about music education in Great Britain. But those were that was one of the funny things, and I mentioned that because Bruce in his memo had said, if you remember anything humorous, and at the time it was really funny.